Storytelling is woven into our DNA as humans. Since the beginning of our time, we've been transmitting our history, information, knowledge, personal anecdotes from person to person. And while the proverbial campfire has changed, we're still effectively doing the same thing. Now, podcast-like platforms give us the opportunity to connect to hundreds, if not thousands of people at once. And if we do it well, it still feels like we're storytelling from one person to another. Now, let me tell you, hosting a podcast is not a little bit of work, and it's not for everyone. But you still have the opportunity to use podcast guesting as a way to connect to the people who actually want to hear what you have to say. So as a service leader, there's a mission that you're passionate about. And there's a group of individuals who you want to serve and stakeholders who you want to invest in and support the work that you're doing. Podcast guesting gives you the opportunity to connect with those individuals at scale. So this episode is really exciting for me because podcast guesting is how I got started as a podcaster, how I got interested in podcasting. And my next guest, Yann Ilunga, actually helped me start this podcast. So he knows a lot about podcast guesting, so much, in fact, that we got into a deep conversation on it. And we talked for so long that we actually decided to split this episode up into two parts. So in part one, you're going to hear about why you should be podcast guesting. If you're not already on board with it, Yann will absolutely convince you that you should be podcast guesting. Then he talks about how to get started as a podcast guest. And finally, how to start to look for the types of shows that you might want to be a guest on. In the second part of this episode, we're going to go on to dive deep into effectively pitching the shows that you want to be on. Then how to actually prepare for your guest interview. When it comes time to be a guest, how do you do so in a really successful way? And finally, Yann is going to share his 3 yes principle to convert listeners to subscribers and customers and stakeholders who want to support the work that you're doing. It's a really information-packed episode with a lot of good stuff, and I know you're going to find value here. So please welcome my guest, Yann Ilunga. Yann, welcome to the show. You've been behind the scenes of Passion and Profits since the beginning, and it's so great to have you here as a guest now.
Hi, Jake. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. It was nice to help you with the concept of the show. It was great to see the show being launched, to see Passion and Profits Without Burnout, to have more and more episodes in its archive. And now it's just awesome to be here with you. I'm on the go, I'm traveling, but really I can't wait to talk all things podcast guesting.
Yeah, of course. So, for everyone who's listening, Yann was really integral in the launch of Passion and Profits. He was a launch coordinator for the show and helped to really, bring it into what it is. And his knowledge of podcasting is so deep and so wide that I asked him here today to share some of that knowledge. So we're going to talk about podcast guesting today. And Yann, can you first share, what podcast guesting is and why it might be, interesting or, an attractive vehicle for, our listeners, service leaders to use?
Just to give a little bit of context, I've been a podcaster since 2014. To date, I've published close to 500 episodes. But if I were starting today, or if I were talking with somebody who doesn't have a podcast and was asking me, should I start my own podcast or should I be a podcast guest? Should I be interviewed for other people's shows? My answer would be go for the latter. go with podcast guesting. For me personally, if you're a service leader, podcast guesting is a must. And there are a couple of things that I think is important to really pay attention to when you start with your podcast guesting journey. The first one is to think about the goals. There may be different reasons why you want to tap into podcast guesting, and you want to really spend a moment to think about those, because those are going to be the sort of compass that guide not only your journey but really decisions you're going to make when you are at when you are at an intersection and you're thinking, should I do this or that as a podcast guest? If you know what you want to achieve through podcast guesting, then it's going to be relatively easy to answer those questions. So what are some of the things you may want to focus on and achieve through guesting? One could be grow your professional network. That's something that is very powerful. Podcasting, it's often been referred to as the best networking tool. So you could look at each interview you do as a guest as an opportunity to add new contacts to your network. Another goal you may want to focus on when it comes to being a podcast guest is to sharpen your speaking skills, or even to start become a speaker, because every interview you do is going to be an opportunity for you to communicate, to share your message. But also, if you're strategic enough, each interview or the majority of interviews you're going to do is going to be an opportunity to be connected with somebody who, for example, organizes a conference, a workshop, a meetup, a sort of event, and you could become a speaker there. Do you want to collaborate more? Guess what? Each interview you do, if you're strategic, could connect you to potential partners and collaborators. As you see here, depending on what you want to focus on, the way you approach podcast guesting is going to be slightly different compared to where you're going for a different type of goal. So you want to think about that. And keep in mind that podcast guesting can open many doors for you. If I think about myself and my business, for example, because of a single podcast interview I did as a guest, I was invited to speak at a conference in Australia. And for reference, I'm based in Helsinki, Finland. So Australia was a unique opportunity to get to a stage that I wouldn't have gotten to otherwise. Another example of an opportunity that I've gotten through podcast guesting is actually getting connected with potential partners, people that I started to collaborate with, and the interview was the sort of icebreaker. And thirdly, I've also gotten clients from podcast guesting. And most people, when it comes to this, they are focusing exclusively on the audience. So they're saying, I want to be interviewed for podcasts that are listened to by small business owners, service leaders, independent artists. But actually, by doing that, you're leaving out of the equation the person you're going to be spending most time with, which is the host. In my case, I've actually gotten clients not only from the audience listening in, but also from the host, him or herself. In some cases, not every interview is going to be like that, but in some cases, the host asked me after the interview, how does it work to hire you? Because I would like to get your help in implementing what we discussed during the interview. As you can tell, again, depending on the goals you're going to be focusing on, there's going to be different opportunities that are going to come your way. And I think it's very important that you focus not only on what you're focusing on goal-wise, on the potential opportunities that are going to come as a result of that. You think about the audience you want to be in front of, but you also focus on the host, because again, that's the person you're going to be spending most of the time with.
Yeah, that's really great insight, Jan. And I think you touched on something really important, the fact that podcasts, while they've been around for many years now, as you know, evidenced by the fact that you've been working on them since 2014, but I know they've been around much longer, and yet there's still so much untapped potential with podcast, and that includes being able to reach audiences that you maybe didn't realize you could before. So international audiences, certainly. I mean, the fact that you and I, work together is evidence of that. But also local audiences that you maybe didn't realize were right around the corner. People who you can reach in a different way than you may be currently speaking with them. So, Jan, you have some strategies for podcast guesting for someone who has never been a podcast guest. Can you share sort of what are the first steps? How do you get into this world of podcast guesting?
I think when you take your first steps as a podcast guest, you should first start with what we discussed a moment ago. So, your goals, what you want to focus on, and so forth. Then you want to think about a couple of additional things. The first is, what are you actually going to talk about during the interview? You want to take a moment to think about what is your topic of expertise, what is something you have knowledge in, something you're passionate about, and you want to try to come up with a few topic ideas. It could be 3, 4, you don't need to have 20 obviously, but you want to make sure that you have more than one. It's important to keep in mind that you could say, for example, all right, I want to talk about podcast guesting. In my case, for example, sometimes I talk about podcast guesting like we are doing right now. Sometimes I discuss other topics like being a host or growing your business through organic lead generation. What you want to do is you want to select a few topic ideas, and then you want to say, okay, if somebody were to listen to that interview where we talk about podcast guesting, after they're finished listening or watching, what are they gonna walk away with? What are the lessons I wanna pass along? So you wanna think about the topic, you wanna think about the learning outcomes for the listeners, and then you wanna think about how can I present that to a host or a potential host that is gonna interview me. And I would recommend having 2 resources as a podcast guest. The first one, and if you come from the speaking world, then you may have something similar like a speaker sheet, a media kit, however you call it, but it's called a one-page PDF. As a podcast guest, you want to have a one-page document that helps the host see who you are, what are some topics that you could potentially discuss, and then there is your contact information there. So you want to, in terms of the structure or the content of a podcast guest, one sheet, you want to have at least a headshot, a photo, or even a couple. I have a couple. Then you want to have a bio. The bio shouldn't be very long. It needs to be straight to the point, just a couple of just a couple of sentences or a couple of paragraphs at the most. And you want to write it in the third person. So you don't want the bio to say, for example, in my case, I am Yann Ilunga, I'm a lead generation and podcasting consultant, blah, blah, blah. No, I want the bio to be written in the third person so that the host, like Jake, could actually introduce me to the show by literally reading that word by word. So in my case, it would say, Yann Ilunga is a lead generation and podcasting consultant, and so forth. So you want to be mindful of that. Headshot, a bio, then you want to have your suggested interview topics. It could be 3, 4, I would say 5 to 6 at the max. And don't limit yourself to have just the title, let's say podcast guesting, but also try to boil it down in one sentence. What is the main outcome listeners are gonna get out of listening to that episode, or from a huge topic that you may want to address, which is the angle you're gonna approach it from. And then you want to have some contact information. It can be the link to your website, your email address, your phone number, if that's an information you want to share, perhaps links to your most important social media platform. So that's one. Then there is a second resource that I would say many podcast guests have the first one, the PDF, but not many have the second one, which is what I call the podcast guest webpage. That's a simple webpage that is basically an enhanced version of the PDF one sheet. So why having a web page is because you can't have, for example, something like a video or an MP3 file in a PDF, but you can on a podcast guest web page. So what do you want to have on a page like that? Basically everything that is in the PDF one sheet, but on mine, I also have added some of the artworks of some of the podcasts that have featured me. I've added some testimonials, some great things hosts and some listeners have said about me. And then I've also added more pictures that the hosts can use, for example, in the show notes page, or if they want to create some content for social media to promote the episode, they already have them there. We don't have to go back and forth several times. And then I've also linked to a couple of different things. One is the press page I have on my site where people can listen to all the different episodes. Then there is the link to the PDF one sheet, the link to a form that a host needs to fill out in terms of asking me to be a guest on the show, so I get to know a little bit more about their show before I make a decision. And then the final thing, and this is something I haven't shared before because I've just recently done it, but I just said to myself, why didn't I think about this before, is to have a playlist. Now, I've added a Spotify playlist, and the idea there is that hosts can get the opportunity to hear me or see me, if it's a video show, in action through that playlist. So they get a better idea of what I sound like, how I express myself, my style, and so forth. So they can really picture what the experience of me being featured on their show as a guest would look like or would sound like. So I would say having clarity on what you want to discuss and how listeners, viewers are going to benefit from that, and then having these two resources, the podcast guest one sheet, a one-page PDF, and then having the podcast guest webpage are the starting points as a podcast guest.
That's really smart, Yann. And what I appreciate about it, and for those who have never guested before, starting with just this one sheet is a great way to get going. That process of first talking about, or thinking about, like, what are my areas of expertise? What can I speak about intelligently, or what can I teach people about? And then, those case studies, and then getting into the tools. I love that. And for, the web page, if you don't have a website, right? If you're not a speaker or an author or a coach or someone who has their own website, you can also, have a web page or a page in a few different ways. You can do that on LinkedIn. You can have, your featured guest, section on LinkedIn. You could do it with a Facebook page, or just a single landing page that a lot of email marketing softwares will allow you to just create a single landing page. So, don't think you have to go all the way in. But I love that playlist, Yann. I think that's a really smart idea. And I'm thinking, oh, wow, I could do that with, Spotify, with Apple, or a YouTube playlist, depending on, what kind of media I want to put there. So that's great. And we'll include a link to Yann, to your guesting page, so that people can see a great example of that. So so now we kind of understand what we need in order to, start guesting. How do we then find the podcasts that we want to be on? Podcasts that align with, our goals, and hosts that are, really accessible for, helping us further, the type of audience that we want to connect to.
Yeah, that's the question to ask ourselves, because we could be here talk about what we're going to discuss when we are being interviewed. We have resources that we can share with potential hosts, but how do we actually find podcasts to be featured on? I'm about to share a few strategies. A couple of them are, if you implement them, are going to help you find shows to potentially be featured on already in the coming days or weeks. Whereas a couple of those strategies are more long-term strategies, so they are gonna work more in the long run. So you're about to hear a few different options, and then you can pick the one or ones that you think make the most sense for your specific case. So the first strategy, and this is such an easy one, yet it's overlooked by so many people, is to actually look at your network. You could post on Facebook, LinkedIn, whatever, and just see, is there somebody you know that hosts a podcast? You can simply ask, and you'll be surprised by how many podcasters are really welcoming, especially people you know, friends, colleagues, clients, former clients, people, if you have a community, people in your community. So start there. The second strategy is to actually go beyond your network of contacts and look at different social media platforms. A good one is LinkedIn, because what you can do there, you can do a targeted search and you can focus on people who have the title podcaster, podcast host, podcast producer in some cases, talk show host, depending on what you want to focus on. And then you can put specific filters. Let's say if you want to be featured by podcasters who are based in your country, your city, what have you, then you can do so. And LinkedIn is gonna show you a list of people that fit those criteria. So LinkedIn is a great example, a great platform you can do that search on. Then you can even tap into, and this is another strategy, into Facebook groups, for example. I have my own podcasting related Facebook groups, especially now we're talking about. I have my own called Podcast Growth Mastermind, and to date we have over 4,800 members. And sometimes I do have some posts where I make, let's call them calls for podcast guests, meaning people who are in the group and host an interview-based show. They can actually reply to my post and say, hey, I have a podcast about this, and I'm looking guests to interview who could talk about this, and that. There is more podcasting groups. You don't want to be spammy, obviously. You want to follow the guidelines, the rules of the group. But sometimes joining just one group can be a goldmine in terms of podcast guest interview opportunities. So start with your immediate network, look at something like LinkedIn, and tap into Facebook groups. And I think especially if you're having conversations with somebody you know who's about to interview you, and you let them know this is my first interview, they're gonna be more understanding, they're gonna be more helpful, so to say. Not that podcast hosts aren't helpful, but meaning that they're gonna cut you some slack. And I also think it's important to be honest with yourself. I mean, many people wanna be featured on top podcasters. Many people want to be featured on top shows, on A-list podcasts, but I always say you should think like a musician. If you've just started playing, your first performances aren't probably gonna take place at huge arenas or large festivals. You're probably gonna start by basking or maybe playing a small gig at a bar in your neighborhood or something like that. So as a podcaster, and I think to some degree, and I think the same about speaking, by the way, of course, sometimes you can be featured on a big conference, but especially if you haven't had the opportunity to work on your speaking skills, then you want to start with a smaller podcast, smaller show, smaller event, and then as you feel more confident, you work your way up. I think it's important also because the more podcasts you are featured on, the more experience you have, the more enrich you can, the more you can talk about your topic with an enriching way, because you are going to have more experience, more case studies to share, more resources, and so forth. So I think if you are a straight arrow, you just say, all right, hey, just wanted to let you know I'm really excited. I haven't done this before. It's gonna be great, and you're gonna be fine. Then the next two strategies are, as I said earlier, more long-term strategies. So the ones we've looked at up until now, you can implement them right now and gonna start to see some traction. These next two take a little bit more time. They're more thinking about the future. And the first one is to look at podcast matchmaking websites. If you just do a quick Google search, you're gonna find a few of them where basically you create a profile as a guest, you say the kind of podcasts you want to be featured on, the kind of hosts you wanna be connected with, and then the platform is gonna match you with that person. The last strategy I wanna share, again, this goes more in the long term. This is one of my favorite actually. And my suggestion is to look at these last two strategies, so the podcast matchmaking sites and the one we're about to look at long term, when you maybe feel, okay, I'm starting to run out of shows, so to say, to be featured on, then you may want to tap into one of these two or even both of the strategies. The last strategy is to actually look at, if you're an author, you could look at your Amazon author page. And if you scroll down, you're gonna see the Amazon algorithm connecting you, so to say, to similar authors or related authors. If you aren't an author, you can still leverage the strategy the following way. Just enter your keyword or keywords, find popular books, bestsellers, whatever. Find popular books like bestsellers and then look at the author page or authors page if it's more than an author, and look at those related authors. And then what you want to do now is use that list on podcasting platforms like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and enter each of these authors' name. And you're going to be able to see the shows they've been featured on. So if they have their own podcast, that will appear as well. But on Spotify, for example, you can enter somebody's name and then you can choose podcasts, you can select episodes, and you're gonna see all the episodes that that person has been featured on. So by doing this, you know that if it's an author that discusses a similar topic or the same topic as you, that makes you relevant. And if they've been featured on podcasts to talk about that very topic, then you know that you could be the perfect guest for that show. So you already know that, hey, that's an interview-based show. In the past, it has featured somebody who is in my space, in my industry, so why can't I be next? So I would say about these strategies, start with one, make that work, and then implement the other ones, and again, make the distinction between those that are more short-term, more immediate, and then the last two that are more long-term strategies to find shows as a podcast guest.
Fantastic. Great advice. Yann, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate your time and your expertise. I know that it is late there in Europe, so thanks for staying up and hanging out with me.
Great. Again, Jake, thank you so much for welcoming me here on Passion and Profits Without Burnout, and I wish you best of luck with all the episodes to come.
My biggest takeaway from this conversation with Yann is that anyone can learn to be a great podcast guest. Podcasting is so prolific that there is literally a podcast about everything, and there's a podcast for everyone, and they all need great guests like you. I would highly encourage you to review this episode. Use the show notes. They are time-stamped for your convenience, so you can go back and listen to those parts that have action items, the takeaways that you need to start down your path of becoming a great podcast guest. I wish I had a resource like this when I first started podcast guesting back in the day. Yann is such a valuable mentor and coach, and I really appreciate the vast amount of knowledge and information that he shares in this episode. Folks, normally, he charges people for coaching like this. So take advantage of this free information here. We're going to leave contact information for Yann and all of the resources that he talks about in this episode in the show notes as well. So make sure to check them out. Thanks for listening, and thanks to Yann. Take care.